Most people think manipulation is obvious. A lie, a threat, a direct attack. But real manipulation rarely arrives aggressively. It arrives subtly, through emotion, pressure, guilt, confusion, social positioning. And by the time most people realize what's happening, they're already reacting emotionally instead of thinking strategically. That is the mistake, because the moment someone controls your emotions, they begin controlling your behavior. And the people who understand psychology deeply know this better than anyone. They know most human beings are predictable under pressure, easy to provoke, easy to guilt, easy to destabilize, not because they lack intelligence, but because emotion clouds awareness. That's why Machiavelli believed power was never just about force. It was about understanding human nature better than the people around you. Because once you understand behavior, you stop reacting blindly. You start seeing patterns, triggers, motives, weaknesses, strategies, and that changes everything. Today, you're going to understand 10 psychological principles that help you protect your mind when dealing with manipulative, toxic, or emotionally strategic people. Not to become cruel, not to exploit others, but to stop being controlled emotionally by people who understand social pressure better than you do. Because if you do not understand psychological games, you will eventually become trapped inside them. Red triangle pointed down trick 1. Never react immediately. This is the first mistake most people make. They react instantly, emotionally, automatically. Someone insults them. They defend themselves. Someone disrespects them. They escalate immediately. Someone tries provoking them. They respond without thinking. And in that moment, control shifts. Because emotional reactions reveal information. Your triggers, your insecurities, your emotional weak points. That is why emotionally manipulative people provoke reactions intentionally. Not always because they are angry, but because reactions create leverage. A calm person is difficult to control. An emotional person becomes predictable. That's why psychological discipline begins with pause, silence, space between stimulus and response. Because the moment you stop reacting automatically, you start regaining control of the interaction. Machiavelli understood something dangerous. The person who controls themselves becomes harder to control externally. Red triangle pointed down trick 2. Never explain yourself excessively. Manipulative people often create pressure intentionally, not to understand you, but to make you over-explain yourself emotionally. And most people fall into the trap immediately. They justify, clarify, defend, add more details. Believing more explanation creates more understanding. But psychologically, excessive explanation often weakens position. Because every added detail creates another opportunity for challenge, another opening for criticism, another angle for manipulation. That's why calm, emotionally grounded people speak with precision, not defensively. They say what is necessary, then stop, because confidence rarely over-explains itself. And people who constantly seek validation through explanation quietly communicate uncertainty. Red triangle pointed down trick 3. Observe what people do when they don't get their way. Pressure reveals character, not comfort. Anyone can appear kind when situations benefit them. But the moment someone loses control, gets ignored, gets challenged, their true psychology appears. Watch carefully. Do they become manipulative, passive-aggressive, emotionally explosive, guilt-driven? Because behavior under frustration reveals emotional maturity faster than words ever will. Machiavelli understood this clearly. People reveal themselves most honestly during emotional discomfort. That's why intelligent individuals observe patterns instead of promises. Because words are controlled, reactions are not. Red triangle pointed down trick 4. Silence creates psychological pressure. Most people fear silence. Because silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty creates discomfort. Manipulative individuals often rely on emotional momentum, fast conversations, fast reactions, fast emotional escalation. But silence interrupts momentum. It forces people to reveal more than they intended. That's why emotionally disciplined individuals understand the power of stillness, not forced silence, controlled silence, the ability to remain calm without rushing to fill emotional space. Because psychologically, the person who becomes uncomfortable first usually loses control first, and people reveal enormous amounts about themselves trying to escape silence. Red triangle pointed down trick 5. Never argue with emotionally committed people. This is one of the hardest lessons intelligent people learn. Not every disagreement is intellectual. Some are emotional investments disguised as logic. And emotionally invested people rarely seek truth. They seek validation, which means facts alone usually will not change them. That's why wise individuals stop trying to win every argument. Because some conversations are not battles of intelligence. They are battles of ego. And ego rarely surrenders peacefully. Machiavelli understood something most people ignore. Energy is a resource. And wasting energy trying to convince emotionally defensive people often creates exhaustion without results. That's why strategic withdrawal is sometimes the highest form of intelligence. Red triangle pointed down trick 6. People reveal their intentions through consistency. Anyone can fake behavior temporarily. Anyone can pretend to care, pretend to respect, pretend to support you. But consistency exposes reality. Patterns reveal intention. That's why psychologically aware individuals stop judging people by isolated moments. They study repetition, repeated dishonesty, repeated disrespect, repeated selfishness, because human beings eventually reveal who they are behaviorally, even when their words say otherwise. And once you understand this, you stop becoming emotionally confused by contradiction. You stop listening only to promises. You start observing actions. Red triangle pointed down trick 7. Emotional detachment destroys manipulation. Manipulation depends on emotional access. Fear, guilt, validation, approval. That's the fuel. And people who desperately need emotional reassurance become easier to influence psychologically, because their behavior becomes externally dependent. The emotionally grounded person behaves differently. They still care, still feel, still connect, but they do not emotionally collapse every time someone disapproves of them. And that changes power dynamics immediately, because emotionally stable individuals are difficult to pressure, difficult to guilt, difficult to destabilize. Machiavelli understood this deeply. The person desperate for approval usually becomes controlled by it. Red triangle pointed down trick 8. Never reveal everything you know. This is one of the oldest psychological principles of power. Overexposure weakens leverage. Most people reveal too much too quickly. Their plans, their emotions, their frustrations, their insecurities. And emotionally strategic people collect that information carefully. Because information creates advantage. That's why disciplined individuals practice limitation, not dishonesty, restraint, the ability to keep some thoughts private, some intentions protected, some emotions controlled, because mystery creates uncertainty, and uncertainty prevents easy manipulation. Red triangle pointed down trick 9. Watch how people treat those below them. Character is easiest to fake upward, toward powerful people, useful people, important people. But real psychology appears downward, toward waiters, employees, people with no status. That's where ego becomes visible. Because respect built only on hierarchy is not respect. It is calculation. And psychologically aware individuals never ignore this. Because arrogance eventually spreads everywhere, even if hidden temporarily. That's why emotional intelligence includes observation beyond words. The smallest interactions often reveal the deepest truths. Red triangle pointed down. Trick 10. The most dangerous person is the one who controls themselves. Most people think power looks aggressive, dominant, loud, intimidating. But real psychological power often appears calm, controlled, measured, because self-control creates unpredictability, and unpredictability creates caution. The emotionally reactive person becomes readable, easy to provoke, easy to manipulate, easy to guide emotionally. But the disciplined individual creates uncertainty. You cannot easily predict what affects them, what provokes them, what controls them, and that changes interactions completely. Because emotionally disciplined people force others to move carefully, not through fear, but through awareness. Red triangle pointed down. The dark reality of human nature. Now understand this carefully. Most manipulation is not dramatic. It is subtle. A tone shift, a guilt trip, a strategic silence, an emotional reaction designed to destabilize you. And most people never notice these patterns because they focus only on words. But psychology operates underneath words. In emotional dynamics, behavioral patterns, social pressure. That's why awareness matters more than aggression. Because once you become aware, you stop reacting automatically. You stop becoming emotionally programmable. And that changes your entire presence. You become calmer, harder to provoke, harder to manipulate, harder to emotionally control. Not because you became cold, but because you became aware. Red triangle pointed down. Final understanding. The truth is, outsmarting manipulative people is not about becoming manipulative yourself. It is about becoming psychologically disciplined, emotionally aware, strategically calm. Because the greatest advantage you can have in difficult interactions is self-control. Once you control your emotions, you control your decisions. Once you control your decisions, you control your direction. And once that happens, people lose the ability to pull you emotionally wherever they want. That is real psychological strength. Not domination, not cruelty, control. But understand this. The deepest manipulators rarely look dangerous. They often appear charming, friendly, emotionally intelligent. And if you cannot recognize those masks, you may trust the wrong people long before you realize the game being played. Because the most dangerous manipulation is the kind that feels safe in the beginning. Red triangle pointed down. Rule 4. People reveal themselves through small reactions. Most people focus on big moments, big lies, big betrayals, big conflicts. But psychology hides itself inside small behaviors, tiny reactions, subtle shifts. Watch carefully. How does someone react when ignored, corrected, embarrassed, challenged? That reveals more than rehearsed words ever will. Because emotional pressure removes performance, and pressure exposes character. The arrogant person becomes defensive. The manipulative person becomes passive-aggressive. The insecure person becomes emotionally reactive. This is why observant individuals pay attention to patterns instead of isolated moments. Because human beings reveal themselves continuously, especially emotionally. And once you understand behavioral patterns, people become easier to read psychologically. Red triangle pointed down. Mid-video subscribe hook. If this video is making you see human behavior differently already, subscribe to Dark Psyche Files. Because most people study motivation. Very few study manipulation. And the people who understand manipulation usually control the emotional atmosphere around everyone else. Red triangle pointed down. Rule 5. The need for approval destroys power. This is one of the deepest psychological weaknesses human beings carry. The need to be liked, accepted, validated, understood. And manipulators exploit this constantly. Because approval-seeking behavior creates dependency. The moment your emotional stability depends on external validation, your behavior becomes externally controllable. That's why emotionally grounded people move differently. They do not emotionally collapse every time someone dislikes them. They do not panic when misunderstood. They do not over-explain themselves desperately hoping for acceptance. Because self-worth creates emotional independence. And emotional independence creates psychological strength. Machiavelli understood this clearly. The person desperate for approval becomes vulnerable to rejection. And vulnerable people become easier to manipulate emotionally. That's why discipline matters more than popularity. Because popularity changes constantly. But self-control remains stable. Red triangle pointed down. Rule 6. Silence makes people reveal themselves. Most people fear silence. Because silence creates discomfort. And discomfort forces exposure. That's why emotionally manipulative individuals often speak constantly. They flood conversations emotionally, fill every space, control momentum. But silence interrupts emotional momentum. It forces people to sit with uncertainty. And uncertainty makes people talk, reveal, explain, overexpose themselves. That's why psychologically disciplined individuals understand strategic silence. Not awkward silence. Controlled silence. The ability to remain emotionally comfortable without needing constant reassurance. Because silence shifts pressure. And whoever handles pressure best usually controls the interaction. Red triangle pointed down. Rule 7. Never fight every battle. Emotionally reactive people engage with everything. Every insult. Every criticism. Every disagreement. And slowly, their energy disappears. Because constant emotional engagement creates exhaustion. Wise individuals understand something dangerous. Not every conflict deserves access to your mind. Some people provoke reactions simply to drain emotional energy. And the moment you engage emotionally, you reward the behavior. That's why strategic withdrawal creates power. The ability to disengage without guilt. Without emotional collapse. Without needing the final word. Because sometimes silence communicates superiority more effectively than argument ever could. Red triangle pointed down. Final understanding. The truth is, most psychological battles are invisible. They happen beneath conversations, beneath words, inside emotional dynamics. And the people who understand those dynamics often influence others quietly without being noticed. That's why awareness changes everything. Because once you understand emotional manipulation, you stop reacting automatically. You stop becoming emotionally programmable. You become calmer, harder to provoke, harder to guilt, harder to emotionally control. Not because you became cold, but because you became conscious. And consciousness creates choice. That is real power. Not domination. Not intimidation. Self-control. Because the person who controls themselves eventually becomes difficult for others to control. Red triangle pointed down. Outro plus subscribe loop. But understand this carefully. Manipulation is only one layer of human psychology. Because some people do not control others through emotion. They control them through perception, reputation, social influence. And once you understand how perception shapes reality, you begin seeing power in a completely different way. So subscribe to Dark Psyche Files. Because the next video will reveal the hidden psychology behind social status, influence, and why some people command respect before they even speak.